Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Five. Today, I have a gripping story for you, one about justice, perseverance, and the triumph of truth. This story takes place in Minneapolis, Minnesota, on a cold, late autumn night. A shocking event unfolded. A black woman was framed by the police for a crime that never even happened. But what those officers didn't know was that this woman was no ordinary citizen. Our main character today is Aisha Williams, a woman with the power to make an entire corrupt system tremble. And now, let's begin the story. Minneapolis, Minnesota, a late autumn night. The few golden leaves left on the sidewalk swirled in the cold wind. Streetlights cast long streaks of light onto the damp pavement, stretching like endless roads. The city was quieter than usual, but somewhere in the shadows, a storm was about to begin. Aisha Williams sat behind the wheel of her black SUV, her sharp eyes fixed straight ahead. It had been a long day, and all she wanted was to go home, make herself a hot cup of tea, and fall into a deep sleep. She was no stranger to dangerous situations, but she had no idea that within minutes, going home would no longer be an option. As her car slowly approached a deserted intersection, Aisha spotted a stop sign reflecting in her headlights. She came to a full stop, carefully scanning her surroundings before making a slow left turn. Suddenly, the piercing sound of a police siren shattered the silence behind her. Red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror, slicing through the night. Cops. Aisha stayed calm and pulled over to the side of the road. She had done nothing wrong. There was no reason to be worried, but her instincts told her otherwise. From the patrol car behind her, two white officers stepped out. One was tall and muscular, his chiseled face exuding authority. John Smith. The other, slightly shorter with a stockier build, narrowed his eyes as if searching for something. David Lee. They weren't in a hurry. They moved slowly, savoring the moment. Aisha placed both hands on the steering wheel, her gaze steady, but sharper now. As Smith reached her window, he aimed his flashlight directly at her face, the blinding light making her squint. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you know why we pulled you over?" His voice dripped with smugness, as if he already had the upper hand. Aisha met his gaze through the harsh beam of light. "No, officer, I don't believe I did anything wrong." Smith let out a small chuckle. "Is that so? Well, let me tell you, you ran that stop sign back there." Aisha frowned. That wasn't true. "I came to a complete stop before turning," she said firmly. Smith shook his head with a smirk, like she had just said something amusing. "That's what you think? Well, we don't." David Lee stepped closer, his eyes drifting over her car. "You live around here?" Lee asked, a hint of disdain in his tone. Aisha could feel the shift in energy. "Yes, about 5 minutes from here." Lee nodded, eyeing her vehicle. "Nice car. What do you do for a living?" Aisha felt irritation rise but kept her composure. "I'm a consultant." Smith raised an eyebrow, glancing at Lee. "A consultant, huh? Consultant for what?" "I don't think I'm required to answer that," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. The two officers exchanged glances. A flicker of satisfaction flashed in their eyes. "License and registration," Smith said, his tone turning colder. Without a word, Aisha handed over her documents. Smith took them, but didn't bother looking at them right away. Instead, he studied her, as if waiting for a crack in her composure. But Aisha wasn't going to break. Smith walked back to the patrol car, supposedly to run her information, but she knew better. Moments later, Lee's voice called out from behind her car. "Hey, Smith, Come check this out." Aisha's stomach tightened. Smith returned, stepping to where Lee was standing by her trunk. They exchanged hushed words before Smith walked back to her window, his expression now serious. "Ms. Williams," he said, his voice lower, heavier, "do you know anything about the bag in your trunk?" Aisha's brows knitted together. "What bag?" Lee suddenly lifted the trunk and held up a clear plastic bag filled with a white, powdery substance. "This bag," Lee said, smirking, "looks like we just found a significant amount of narcotics in your vehicle." Aisha stared at the bag. She knew it wasn't hers. They had planted it. "That's not mine," she said, her voice now quiet but firm. Smith and Lee exchanged another look before chuckling. "Oh, of course," Smith said, shrugging. "Everyone says that." Lee stepped closer, his eyes glinting with amusement as he pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Ms. Williams, you're under arrest for possession with intent to distribute." Aisha didn't react immediately. She took a deep breath, locking eyes with the two men before her. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said, enunciating every word. Lee only laughed, yanking her arms behind her back and snapping the cuffs around her wrists. "Let's see how tough you are in jail," he whispered in her ear. Aisha didn't resist. She had seen this scenario too many times before. Black people framed, accused without cause, thrown behind bars by a system rigged against them. But this time they had no idea who they were dealing with. The cold steel of the handcuffs tightened around Aisha's wrists, the sharp clink of metal echoing through the still night. She didn't struggle. She didn't protest. She simply stood there, her deep, dark eyes locked onto the two officers before her, not a single trace of fear in her gaze. Smith and Lee thought they had won. They thought they had successfully set her up, turning her into just another statistic, another black life crushed by the system. But Aisha only smiled, a slow, deliberate smile. "What the hell are you smiling at?" Smith snapped, irritation flashing across his face. "I was just wondering." Aisha tilted her head slightly, her voice calm. "Are you two ready to deal with the consequences?" Lee let out a short laugh, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Consequences? Who do you think you are? A lawyer? A politician?" Aisha didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth would speak for itself. They shoved her into the back seat of the patrol car, the heavy door slamming shut with a resounding thud. She watched through the window as the car pulled away, leaving the quiet street behind, plunging into the darkness. The city blurred past, street lights flickering across her face, reflecting in her eyes, sharp, knowing, unreadable. Inside the car, another plan was already in motion. At the Minneapolis police station, a heavy silence hung in the air as Aisha walked in. Her heels clicked softly against the tiled floor, each step echoing through the quiet space. Curious eyes followed her, some officers whispering among themselves, but no one spoke up. Smith and Lee led her past rows of desks, throwing her smug, challenging looks. They knew this routine all too well. They knew how to build a story. They knew how to blur the truth. But this time, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Aisha was no ordinary victim. They led her into the interrogation room, a small bare space with nothing but a metal table and two chairs facing each other. Smith tossed a file onto the table, smirking. "Well then, Ms. Williams," he said, crossing his arms, "anything you'd like to say before we write up our report?" Aisha leaned back, crossing her legs, her expression as calm as it had been when they arrested her. "Number, I'll let my lawyer do the talking." Lee scoffed. "A lawyer? Who do you think is coming for you? You're just another suspect, not someone important." Aisha met his gaze, her eyes sharp as a blade. "Is that so? You sure about that?" Both officers hesitated for a split second. A flicker of uncertainty crossed their faces. Aisha had something most wrongfully accused never did: a powerful network and real influence. While Aisha was being held at the police station elsewhere in the city, a man was watching everything unfold from a distance. Michael Brown, a young officer new to the force, sat in front of his computer, his fingers tapping restlessly on the desk. From the moment Aisha was brought into the station, something hadn't felt right. As Carter and Sullivan laughed, gloating over the arrest, Michael couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. A woman driving a luxury SUV, well-dressed, composed, and showing no signs of criminal activity. And yet, somehow, drugs had magically appeared in her trunk. Michael decided to dig deeper. He opened his computer and typed, "Aisha Williams." Into the system. Within seconds, a flood of information appeared on his screen, and as his eyes landed on the first line, his heart nearly stopped. Full name: Aisha Williams. Occupation: National Security Consultant. Agency: CIA. Michael pulled his gaze away from the screen, his breathing unsteady. She's not just a civilian. She was a government agent. Within less than an hour, phones were ringing across high-level offices. A few blocks away from the police station, Robert Wilson, a seasoned FBI agent, received an urgent call. As he listened to the details from the other end of the line, he muttered a curse under his breath. "I'll handle this immediately." Wilson hurried out to his car, phone still pressed to his ear. "I want every single file from the Minneapolis police station on my desk in 10 minutes. Meanwhile, Carter and Sullivan remained oblivious. They were too busy basking in their so-called victory. But outside, a storm was coming, and there was nowhere for them to hide. As Robert Wilson stepped into the police station, the atmosphere shifted instantly. He didn't need to say much. The presence of the FBI spoke for itself. Smith and Lee quickly sensed that something was wrong. "What's the problem?" Smith asked, trying to keep his tone steady. Wilson locked eyes with him. "The problem is, you just arrested the wrong person." Before Smith could respond, Wilson tossed a file onto the table. "She's not just a civilian, she's a government agent, and you just made a very big mistake." The room grew thick with tension. Lee stiffened, his eyes widening. "What?" Wilson didn't bother answering. Instead, he turned to Aisha, who remained calm in her chair. "Ms. Williams, you're free to go." Within days, the Minneapolis police station was in full-blown crisis. Smith and Lee were immediately suspended. A deep investigation was launched, not just into Aisha's case, but into dozens of wrongful arrests before hers. The media exploded. Those who once carried themselves with power and authority were now in handcuffs, dragged into the harsh light of justice. Michael Brown, the officer who dared to break the silence, was hailed as a hero. And Aisha Williams? She didn't need revenge. Justice had found its way on its own. All she had to do was stand still and watch the downfall of those who once believed they controlled everything. They were wrong, and this mistake, this one mistake, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As Smith and Lee sat under interrogation by FBI agent Robert Wilson, the tension inside the Minneapolis police station was thicker than ever. Officers whispered among themselves, exchanging uneasy glances. No one had expected it. Two of their own, men who had once abused their power with impunity, were now being taken down in the very building they used to control. Aisha Williams stepped out of the holding cell, her sharp gaze scanning the faces around her. She had witnessed countless investigations throughout her career, but this time it was different. This wasn't just about her wrongful arrest. This was a reckoning for the entire system. Michael Brown, the young officer who had dared to speak up, stood near his desk, his expression heavy with thought. He still couldn't quite believe that he had played a role in taking down men who had once wielded so much unchecked power. Aisha stopped in front of him, her eyes softening. "You did the right thing." Michael looked up, slightly caught off guard. "I just did what needed to be done," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "I'm not sure it'll change anything." Aisha gave him a small nod. "No one can change an entire system overnight, but you laid the first brick, and that matters." Michael swallowed hard, unsure of what to say, but deep down he knew. He had crossed a line he could never step back from, and he was ready to accept it. A few weeks later, the trial of John Smith and David Lee officially began. The media erupted, headlines dominating the front pages. Minneapolis police officers charged with framing innocent citizen. Is the justice system crumbling from within? Does justice truly exist for people of color? The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every eye locked onto the two defendants. Smith and Lee sat at the defense table, their faces cold, but the confidence they once carried was nowhere to be seen. They were no longer powerful officers issuing orders and manipulating the system. Now, they were criminals facing justice. Aisha Williams stepped onto the witness stand facing the court. The prosecutor approached, his voice clear and firm. "Ms. Williams, please tell the jury what happened that night." Aisha took a deep breath, then began recounting everything. From the moment she was unjustly pulled over, the way Smith and Lee handled her, to how they had so conveniently discovered drugs in her trunk. The audience listened in growing outrage. Then the real blow came. The evidence. Security camera footage from inside the police station, something Smith and Lee had never considered, captured their conversation right before booking Aisha. Their mocking words, their smug satisfaction at thinking they had successfully ruined an innocent woman's life, every moment was laid bare before the court. The jury exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. The truth could no longer be buried. But the moment that truly shocked the courtroom was Michael Brown's testimony. When called to the stand, he stepped forward, tension etched across his face. He knew that testifying against fellow officers could very well destroy his career, but he also knew that staying silent meant being complicit. Michael looked directly at the jury and spoke clearly. "I couldn't stand by and watch injustice happen. I reviewed the case files and discovered that this wasn't the first time these actions had taken place." The courtroom stirred with murmurs. Michael continued, "I found dozens of other cases with similarly fabricated evidence, and they all had one thing in common. The accused were always people of color." Silence fell over the room. His words weren't just testimony. They were an indictment of the entire system. Finally, after days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Smith and Lee were found guilty of legal fraud, evidence tampering, and abuse of power. Their sentences were severe, not just prison time, but the lasting disgrace of becoming symbols of corruption within American law enforcement. A few days after the trial ended, Aisha met Michael Brown at a small cafe near the Mississippi River. Michael looked exhausted, but something in his eyes had changed, a sense of resolve, an awakening. Aisha slid a cup of coffee toward him. "You did good," she said. Michael let out a tired smile. "Not everyone thinks so. I might lose my job." Aisha nodded. "Maybe. But justice needs people who are willing to speak up, and you did what most wouldn't dare to do." Michael was quiet for a moment, then let out a deep sigh. "I used to believe this system was meant to protect everyone, but now I see it only protects the people it chooses to." Aisha smiled, her voice calm but certain. "That's true, but it can change because of people like you." Michael looked at her, and for the first time since this all began, he felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could be different one day. Aisha Williams' story is not just about a woman fighting to clear her name. It is a story about the system, about justice, and about those who dare to stand up for the truth. It is a reminder that the truth can never stay buried forever. Those in power may manipulate the law for a time, but they can never manipulate the conscience of the people forever. And in the end, justice will always prevail. The trial was over, but its echoes still reverberated throughout Minneapolis. Smith and Lee had been convicted, but that didn't mean the problem had ended. They were just two names on a long list of those who had used their badges to spread fear. Aisha understood that. As she stepped out of the courtroom, she could feel the weight of the stares from those who had followed the case. Some officers looked at her with contempt, others with unease, and a few, like Michael Brown, held onto a sliver of hope that justice could exist within a system that seemed irreparably broken. Michael stood outside, silently watching as people filed out of the courthouse. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for. Maybe some confirmation that he had done the right thing, or perhaps a sign that real change was beginning to take shape. Aisha stopped beside him. "They're not going to change overnight." Michael let out a long sigh, lowering his head. "I know, but I still want to believe that something is different now." Aisha gazed into the distance where the sun was beginning to set over the Minneapolis skyline. "That depends on you." Michael turned to her, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Aisha narrowed her eyes slightly, her voice calm but unwavering. "You can choose to stop here, or you can keep fighting, not just for one case, but for your entire career." Michael said nothing. He had crossed a line he couldn't step back from. But did he have the strength to keep going? The events of the trial sparked a powerful reaction across the community. Minneapolis residents took to the streets in protest, demanding a deeper investigation into police misconduct. People who had once been arrested by Smith and Lee returned, seeking justice for themselves. And then something unexpected happened. Officers from within the department started speaking out. No one could have predicted it. Dozens of officers broke their silence. They spoke about being pressured to falsify reports. They recalled conversations where superiors ordered them to make an arrest just to boost department statistics. And they confirmed a terrifying truth. Smith and Lee were not isolated cases. The FBI immediately expanded its investigation, shifting its focus to the entire Minneapolis Police Department. Old case files were reopened, and with each passing day, more buried injustices were brought to light. Inside the department, tensions ran high. Some officers remained silent, hoping the storm would pass, but others, especially younger officers like Michael, knew that the time for action had come. Michael understood that speaking out could mean the end of his career, but he also knew that if the system wasn't changed from within, nothing would ever truly change. He began gathering like-minded colleagues, forming a group of officers committed to upholding real justice, not just protecting the badge. Change had begun, and this time it wouldn't be so easily silenced. Of course, not everyone welcomed the change. High-ranking officers, those who had worked alongside Smith and Lee, began looking for ways to silence those who dared to speak out. Michael started receiving anonymous threats. His former colleagues avoided him. Some even went out of their way to make his job harder. One night, when he returned to his apartment, he found his front door had been forced open. Someone had gone through everything, leaving only a single sheet of paper on the table with a hastily scrawled message. "If you know what's good for you, keep your mouth shut." Michael clenched his fists. He had known this would happen, but he hadn't expected it to come so soon. He sank into a chair, his mind racing. Was he risking too much? The next morning, Aisha was the first to call him. "You okay?" Michael let out a dry chuckle. "I guess. Just a little reminder that I pissed off the wrong people." Aisha was silent for a moment. "You can walk away. No one would blame you." Michael closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "I know, but I won't." Aisha smiled. "Good, because we're not done yet." The investigation stretched on for months. Finally, the FBI released its findings. A deep-rooted corruption ring within the Minneapolis Police Department had been operating for years, involving high-ranking officers and even members of the judicial system. More than 15 officers were suspended. Some were indicted for evidence tampering. The city's police chief was forced to resign. It was a seismic shift in the system, and it all started with what seemed like a minor incident, one late-night traffic stop that should have never happened. The story of Aisha Williams, Michael Brown, and those who dared to stand up is not just a story about justice. It's a reminder that real change begins with small actions. A young officer brave enough to ask questions, a victim who refused to stay silent, a small group willing to challenge power, and from that, an entire system was forced to change. Racism, injustice, corruption, they only exist as long as people allow them to. But as long as there are people like Michael, like Aisha, like the brave officers who refuse to look the other way, justice is not some distant dream. It is something that can be achieved, and that, my friend, is the true meaning of change. Minneapolis was no longer the same. The FBI investigation had sent shockwaves through the city, far beyond what anyone had expected. Trials were held one after another. Dozens of officers were investigated. Some were convicted, and others, no matter how deep or small their involvement, were forced to resign. But that didn't mean everything had been fixed. In fact, for some, this storm only made them resent change even more. The officers loyal to the old system looked at those arrested with a sense of loss, as if justice itself had betrayed them. Some citizens believed it was all just a political show, a staged purge meant to appease public outrage. And then there were those like Michael Brown, officers who wanted to do the right thing, but now found themselves trapped between two worlds. Michael could feel the isolation growing stronger each day. His former colleagues no longer greeted him the same way. Some avoided him altogether. Others glared at him with quiet fury. One day, when he entered the locker room, he saw it, scrawled across his locker in thick red marker. Traitor. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to ignore it. But he knew things would never be the same again. Even though the police department had changed leadership and reform promises had been made, people like Aisha Williams knew that justice wasn't just a courtroom verdict. Justice was a long battle, and the enemy wasn't always easy to see. Aisha had been keeping an eye on things from a distance. After leaving Minneapolis, she returned to her work, but this case still lingered in her mind. One day, Michael called her. "I think something's happening." Aisha immediately picked up on the tension in his voice. "Tell me." Michael explained that while the investigations had shaken the system, a small group of high-ranking officers was quietly working to restore the old order. They weren't openly resisting the changes, but they were doing everything they could to slow progress and block key reforms. And worse, racially motivated arrests were still happening. Aisha gripped her phone tighter. "Do you have proof?" Michael was silent for a moment. "I think I can get it, but it's going to be dangerous." Aisha knew he was right. Once you dared to go against the system, there would always be those who wanted to silence you. She let out a slow breath. "I'm coming back to Minneapolis." Aisha landed in the city on a freezing winter night. Michael picked her up at the airport, his face more tense than the last time they had seen each other. "There was a recent arrest that didn't sit right with me. A young black man was charged with resisting arrest, but the police dash cam footage shows no sign of him resisting." Aisha nodded. "Who's behind it?" Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "A group of officers who used to work under Smith and Lee. They're sending a message. This wasn't just about one wrongful arrest. It was a warning to people like Michael that if they kept speaking up, they'd be next." And sure enough, not long after, Michael received an anonymous letter. "You should learn to keep your mouth shut." Aisha stared at the words, her expression cold and unreadable. They're scared, and when the corrupt get scared, they become more dangerous. Michael nodded. He knew now this was no longer just a legal battle. This was a fight for the soul of Minneapolis. With the help of a few allies inside the police department, Michael managed to obtain the internal radio recording from the night of the arrest. Aisha listened to it, her face unreadable. Mockett looked like he was resisting. "I don't see him doing anything." "Just do it. We don't let anyone slip past us." Michael swallowed hard. "They're not even trying to hide it anymore." Aisha stood up, her eyes burning with determination. "I think it's time we bring this into the light." They sent the recording to Robert Wilson, the lead FBI investigator. Within hours, the story exploded across the news. The police department was thrown into chaos. Those involved were immediately suspended. Minneapolis residents took to the streets once again, demanding a real change, not just empty promises. This time, there was no denying the truth. A year later, Minneapolis was different. Many officers had been fired, new oversight programs were in place, and those who had been wrongfully framed were finally freed. And Michael Brown? He was still a cop, but now he wasn't alone. The younger officers looked up to him as a role model, a man who stood up even when it was the hardest thing to do. One evening, as Aisha prepared to leave the city once again, Michael drove her to the airport. "Thank you." Aisha shrugged. "Don't thank me. None of this would have happened without you." Michael was quiet for a moment. "So where are you headed now?" Aisha gave a small, knowing smile. "Wherever I'm needed most." They parted ways, but both knew this fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Justice is more than a verdict. It is the courage to create change. Aisha and Michael's story reminds us that fighting injustice is not the work of one person. It is the responsibility of us all, and only when each voice speaks up, when every small action makes a difference, does justice truly exist.